There's one thing that I will really empower your listener is that our brain has plasticity. The thing, like in the last 20 years, there's been an explosion of research into our brain and neuroscience and how our brain is actually working. And we used to think that the brain as an adult was pretty much fixed. But now we realize, no, that's not true. Our brain is constantly rewiring. And those pathways that were created a long time ago are, or can, very easily change.
That was Adele Spraggon, and you're listening to episode 230 of the Building Psychological Strength podcast, where we uncover the information, tools, and techniques to turn our mind into our most valuable asset.
The courage to face fears with persistence.
Being able to be present enough in this moment to choose my response thoughtfully.
We have the strength to bend to life stressors, to bend to adversity without snapping, without breaking.
There are only 6 things that contribute to our quality of life, and they are all experiences.
In every moment, we are deciding who we want to be and how we want to live our lives.
Noticing what your brain is doing and then being able to make choices.
Mobilize the things that we know lift us up.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Building Psychological Strength podcast. My name is April and I'm your host. Right out of the gate, I want to say welcome to anybody who is new to the podcast. We've started releasing some new episodes. Our Friday business-focused episodes are new. Our Monday Mindset Minute Monday episodes are newer. And hello to anybody who has found us either from those episodes or maybe you were given one of our Wednesday deeper dive interview and topical episodes from someone in your life. I just want to say hi and welcome. We have a really great growing community who is devoted to working on themselves, understanding their mind, uncovering personal insight, and really putting the tools and techniques and information from the field of psychology to work in their life so that we can all have a better life experience. Bottom line, that's why I'm here. My background is in psychology. I have had a number of personal experiences that have taught me the absolute precious value of our one life. And I think it is an incredible honor and such a responsibility of mine to share the knowledge from the field of psychology with a wider audience so that you can live better in this one life experience that you're going to have. So hi, welcome. I am so thrilled you're here. This week on the podcast, on this Wednesday episode, we are diving into a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. There are a few things that I adore talking about, and behavior change is one of them. I love talking about habit change. I love talking about the things that make it easier for us to change our behavior and some of the sticking points and the friction points that get in our way. And this week, we are speaking with a behavior change expert, an international award-winning speaker, and the author of the book, Shift: 4 Steps Toward Personal Empowerment. We are speaking with Ms. Adele Spraggon. Adele is absolutely fantastic because she takes a brain science perspective to understanding behavior change. In the beginning of this episode, she talks about the sort of what she calls typical operating instructions that we were all taught. When it comes time to make a change, we all are sort of given the same set of instructions for how to do it. And then when we aren't able to make the change, we get down on ourselves. Instead of doing what she did and questioning, maybe we're missing something here and maybe there's a step that we're not taking into account. And that's where Adele really dove in and got into this work and started to uncover the power and the importance of something she calls brain patterns. I'm so excited for you to hear her unpack this concept, and in particular, the ways in which these brain patterns serve to hold our behavior patterns in the same position and keep us from making changes. You're going to hear so many commonalities. Folks who have been listening to me for a while, you're going to hear Adele speak and you're going to be like, I bet April's dying on the other side of that line while she's speaking, because she's going to say so many things that are in alignment with the way that we have talked about behavior change on this podcast. And I can't wait for you to hear it. All right, guys, One other thing that I want to plug before we get going, Adele mentions her book. She's giving it away for free, friends. All you have to do is pay shipping. There is a link in this episode description to her book. Feel free to visit that link, get your free book from her, and also visit her website. That's linked below as well. This is such an incredible topic because it's something that's relevant to us on a daily, hourly, by the minute basis. So much of our behavior runs on these automatic habits or brain patterns, as Adele calls them. So this episode will give you a little bit more insight into why you behave the way you do, why some things are maybe easy to change and other things are really difficult. So have in mind something that you would like to change about your life as you listen to this episode, and think about applying the steps that Adele mentions during this podcast episode to your own life so that you can start to make the shift that you're looking for. All right, you guys, I'm excited for you to meet Adele. Let's roll that interview. Adele, I am so excited that you're joining us for this episode of the podcast because we're diving into one of my absolute favorite topics ever. So thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, April. I'm looking forward to it.
So you are an expert in behavior change. Tell me how you got to this point, because this isn't, when you're a kid and you're thinking about what you're going to be when you grow up, you kind of know the names of about five different, careers that you could have. You can be a doctor, you can be a teacher, you can be a firefighter, whatever. People don't pick this. How did you find yourself becoming an expert in this area?
That's a great question. I've probably been in this field, April, about 35 years. And initially, when I was teaching behavioral change, I was following all the typical ways that we're taught to change habits and change behaviors. So such as set a goal and then stretch that goal. And then if you're not taking the actionable steps to get there, then change your mindset. And something interesting happened about 10 years into teaching this. I started looking around at all the people that I taught, and I went, why is it that we're not all getting there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that we all aren't just achieving what we set out to achieve? And I myself had done all the different coaching and training that I had been taught. I was an addict to personal development. I'll just call it that way. And I was still facing these internal blocks. And so one day I just said to myself, it can't be us. It can't be. There's something that we're missing. There's something about the operating instructions we've been given that have to be incorrect. So I enrolled myself in university. I went through and I got my master's. And my whole idea was, I'm going to study how the human brain thinks. I'm going to study how the human equation makes decisions and gets to goals and achieves those goals. And what I found was, sure enough, we have been given the wrong operating instructions. And so I took my learnings, I took all of my past experience, and I created new operating instructions. And then I started teaching those. And when I did, the people that I was teaching, instead of that 25% success rate, they started to get 80 to 87, 90% success rates. And I went, okay, now we've got it. So that's when I determined myself, or decided that, yes, I'm going to label myself a behavioral change expert, because that's what I am. And let's set out to actually achieve those goals effectively.
Amazing. Let's back up then. Let's talk about some of these operating instructions that you found to be incomplete. Like, give us the typical picture that people get, or the typical message or set of instructions that people get.
Yeah, and I'm sure every listener is familiar with these, right? So we are taught, okay, what do you want to achieve? What do you want to do? Vision it, set that goal in mind, or that vision of your future self as you want to be. And then the question is, okay, now that you've set the goal, what are the steps that you need to take to get to that goal? These are the typical operating instructions, and the person will say, well, okay, so I want a really great relationship. So I have to first meet the ideal partner, and then I have to determine if they're the right partner. And then I'm going to go on dates and all of this stuff, right? And know myself, know each other, know how to communicate. And if that person is not dating, for example, now you're taught, okay, well, let's upgrade your mindset. Let's get a positive mindset here so that you can actually create that ideal relationship. And all of that's great. But many, many people who don't have the brain patterns to set and achieve those goals, now they get stuck. Right? So now they start procrastinating, for example, or they start avoiding taking those actions, or they create the same mistakes over and over and over again, right? They keep dating the same person, even though that person is not ideal, if we use the example that I'm using. And then worst thing that happens next is we are either told, okay, then you've got the wrong goal, change the direction you want to go in, or worse, there's something wrong with you, right? And so at that point, we give up. We typically tend to change our direction, give up on our dreams, or just swim in a world of blame and shame in which we don't move forward, right?
I love it. I mean, I don't love it because that's a story of how we find ourselves feeling quote unquote stuck or unable to make progress. And what's underneath, there's a couple of things that I love that you said that's underneath this. And I think we're going to need to really unpack these is you touched on, and we'll go deeper here, this idea of brain patterns. Tell me a little bit about that, because there's a fundamental to the message that I like to give people that I think is embedded here. So I'm curious to see, I swear I'm not setting you up, but I'm curious to see if we end up in the same position, because I think we're going to. So can you dive into what you mean by brain patterns?
Absolutely. So, Anil Seth has this wonderful way of looking at the brain. And when your listener hears this, they will understand it immediately. So here we have this brain, and it's locked inside this bony skull, and it has no access to the outside world, not directly, right? So it's quiet in the brain. There's no sound. There's no sights inside this bony skull. And so the only thing the brain has to go on is electrical impulses in which it takes information that it comes from its past, right? And it uses it to try and figure out what's going on out here, right? And each of those neural pathways that this electrical impulse is going down is delivering to us a particular belief or a particular behavior or a particular action. And that's what the brain goes on. And it goes on that all the time, right? And when we think about an issue that we're having in life, typically a person will look in a number of different places. The first place they might look is out there, and they might think, okay, the behavior exists in that other person. It's them that is the problem. Or they'll look at the situation and they'll say, okay, the problem is in the situation. If I just fix the situation, then everything will change. Or they say, okay, there's something wrong with me. I need to fix myself. I've got to change my mindset, and then everything will be okay. All right. But when we start to think about how the brain is and how the brain works, we start to see, well, hang on a minute, the problem actually has to be in that neural wiring, that neural pathway that is delivering me the information that tells me there is a problem. Yeah. Am I making sense, April? So interrupt me at any time. Okay.
Nope, you're absolutely making sense.
So if we know that brain pattern is originating or coming first, and then the problem comes second, now we can start to flip the switch and say, all right, the first place I have to work on is that brain pattern. I got to stop fixing the problem, because I don't even know if the problem actually lives out there, but I know with 100% certainty that my brain is wired in the direction of that problem. And if I can change that wiring, then that problem will go away.
Here's what I love about that. That wiring that happens, it occurs, our neurons map onto each other, and our mind maps all of these different pathways through experiences we've had, implicit and explicit teaching that things that we've learned. Very much less often does it really have anything to do with us choosing how that wiring happens, right?
Bang
like
on.
it's so passive of a process. And this is what I love about the way that you were explaining this just a moment ago. Because if you really think about it, that our mind is sort of passively wiring itself just as we float through this life, especially early on, right? Especially our more quote formative years neurologically. You start to see that your inability to change or the difficulty you're having, or maybe as you revert back to habits that you wish you weren't doing anymore or thought you had gotten over, but you haven't, as we sort of trip up and have difficulty and meet friction, one thing that people have a tendency to do is to blame themselves and to get really, really down on themselves about why can't I just be stronger? Why can't I just change? When in fact, one of the things that's making it so difficult for you to change was completely out of your control in the first place.
Right.
So you're fighting against forces that are so strong. Give yourself a break a little bit. Like, I'm not saying don't try. I'm not saying get apathetic, but know that you are, and my business partner in Peak Mind says this so beautifully. She's like, know that you are a human being who is constrained by biology, who is constrained by some of these things that are just human in nature. They just are for you. And we're going to struggle with them a little bit. So I love that you went there with these brain patterns, because it's not something that we actively choose.
Right, exactly. So I like to say that we're not born with patterns. We create those patterns from the moment we enter into this world, even in the womb, some of them. But as soon as we're born, our brain starts to very rapidly create as many patterns as it can. And a lot of patterns, many of our patterns are created before the age of 5 years old. So why are we blaming ourselves, right? For a pattern that was created way back when that just continues to exist within our brain. But I love what you were saying. But there's one thing that I will really empower your listener is that our brain has plasticity. The thing, like in the last 20 years, there's been an explosion of research into our brain and neuroscience and how our brain is actually working. And we used to think that the brain as an adult was pretty much fixed. But now we realize, no, that's not true. Our brain is constantly rewiring. And those pathways that were created a long time ago are or can very easily change. The problem is that nobody's taught us how. Right?
Yeah.
So that's why we feel so locked in our biology, we'll call it, because nobody has actually sat down and said, okay, here's how you change a brain pattern. And once you know how to do that, then it is actually quite effortless to achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve or create the happiness that we want to create, because we're working with our operating manual, right? Which is our brain. And so knowing, okay, here's what's not working for me. And I like to say, April, there's only one question to ask yourself. Does it work? Let's forget about right or wrong. Okay. Let's put aside all considerations of right or wrong, because that's not going to help us. If it's not working, to be able to say, okay, I've got a brain pattern that's not working and I know how to upgrade it. Now you're empowered.
Yeah. I want to go there in just a moment, but I want to make sure that I cue our listeners to another episode that is somewhat along the same topic. If you're interested in this idea of neuroplasticity, of neurogenesis, episode 215 with Dr. Brant Courtwright, we talked about these topics in the context of mental illness and some other issues. It's going off in a different direction, but I bring that up because this idea of neuroplasticity and of our brain generating new cells, rewiring itself, really being a living, breathing organ, not a static thing since, age 5, as, so many of us were taught, that the implications of that and the ripple effect in so many different directions, it's just vast. So totally different topic, totally different type of episode. But if you're curious about all of the ripple effects of what we're talking about right now, listen to the rest of this episode and check out 215 as well, because it's a totally different direction, but same starting point or principle.
I love it.
So you mentioned about how we do this rewiring, because here we're talking about really the underlying fundamental mechanisms through which our behavior is determined. So much of it runs on patterns, runs on habits, runs on these grooves that we've carved over, years and years of experience to some degree, that it can feel really hard and challenging to make changes. So talk a little bit about your experience in how people start to do that, how they change some of these brain patterns and habits in order to get a better outcome.
Yeah, great question. So, the first thing to know is that I like to say it this way, and then it's not true, but it's just an easy metaphor for the brain. The brain's a little lazy, right?
Yes. It is a lot lazy sometimes. Keep going. Oh, I like you so much.
If it can stick to the same action, it will, right? And as long as it feels like that is survival, which, that's what the brain is primarily worried about, is your survival. Then as long as it can survive, then great. It's not interested in thriving. And that's really important to know. So, just knowing that, we can say, okay, does that pattern work? That's the first thing. And then we need to be able to identify what a pattern is. So I'm going to give a metaphor of the brain. All right. The top of the water, let's say that your brain is an iceberg, easiest way to picture your brain. And at the top of the water are all of your actions, all of your behaviors, all of your beliefs. So let's just place everything that you do, everything that you think, and every behavior you adopt up there. Under the water, we can place patterns. And a pattern is simply an intertwined physical sensation, emotion, and thought. When the three aspects of our being come together, they result in a particular action, a particular behavior, a particular belief. Okay? Now, let's go back to what I was saying initially. Our only question is, does it work or doesn't it? So if let's say that you've set a goal, and this is what you're going to do in your life, and then you find that you're not doing anything to get you there, right? So you know the actions that you're supposed to take, and you're just procrastinating, for example. Great, that doesn't work. And that's all you need to do. There's no need to make anything wrong. It's just, all right, that pattern doesn't work. Then the first step is to identify what pattern starts to run when you think about taking that action step. Okay, so how do I feel about that? Where do I feel that in the body? What is my one thought that my mind spits out when I'm going to take that action? So it might be, going on a date, for example, if we go back to my initial example, and it can be anything. I mean, we have goals about everything. So anything that you position as the goal is fine. But let's say it's going on a date, and you start to check in with yourself, and putting aside all that positive thinking and everything else that we're told to do, and check in on what's really, really happening. And your listener starts to notice, wow, I'm feeling a little nervous here. And my thought is, I'm going to be judged. Right. And I feel that. And when I do, I just want to avoid, I just want to run away. And so my physical sensation is one of contraction and closing in. Great. That's a pattern. Knowing that's a pattern, then all you have to do next is remove that pattern. Okay. So that's the key piece that most people miss. And all of our standard operating instructions tell us just to change that pattern. But remember, the brain's a little lazy and it doesn't want you to change that pattern because it knows that you can survive as long as you keep that pattern.
Yes. I love it. Yes.
But it doesn't know that you can survive without that pattern. And so it will hold on to it. It will just say, no, the unknown is scarier than the known, even though the known is making you miserable.
Yes. This is that where I cringe a little when we talk about comfort zone, because it's familiarity zone. It's very uncomfortable a lot of times, but it's familiar. It's the devil we know. So we're going to hang with it. I love it. I love it so much. Keep going.
Yes. So step 2 is to own it as a pattern. Let's flip that switch. It's not occurring out there, like I was saying. It's not in the situation. It's not that there's something wrong with you. It's not that you have to change your beliefs or change your behavior or force yourself or butt up against that comfort zone and force yourself to do something that you're uncomfortable. None of that is where the problem lies. Knowing that it's a pattern, we can flip the switch and we can say, okay, that's my pattern. I created that pattern a long time ago. You didn't mean to, but it is inside the brain, and that will give you power and control over it. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Not in the way of forcing it to be different, just in the way of, all right, now I know where the real issue lies. It's here in me, in my brain. Right. So that's step 2. Then step 3, we have to remove that pattern. So, this is where I'm going to lose your listener a little bit. So I'm going to invite your listener just to empty your cup, just try and stretch a little bit here. Okay. So the pattern is an intertwined physical sensation, emotion, and thought. The 3 aspects of our being come together into creating a particular action, behavior, belief. What would happen, April, if we could just tease that apart and just put the physical sensation just as a physical sensation, independent of the thought, independent of the emotion, right? So in that case, that intertwining, that resulting action would just disappear. If we, to put it simply, let me just try and put a simpler metaphor here. You've got a pathway in your brain where an electrical impulse is traveling down, and that's a neural pathway. And we can just tease that pathway apart. And then what happens is it would just snap into different channels, and that new pattern would just take a brand new action. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Without the effort that we're used to putting into doing stuff. When we try and use control to do it, that's when we often run into trouble.
Mm-hmm.
That's when we get stopped, because the brain's going, no, stay here. This is safe. That's not, we're not going to do that. And so that's when we lock in and everything becomes an effort.
Yeah. It's interesting because we recently had a conversation. We have one of our flagship programs, or our flagship program in Peak Mind is called Ascend. And it's a very large understand you, your mind, and then do some life design is all in this program. And we have live calls for our students in this program. And on our most recent live call, we started talking about a small portion of what you just said around emotions that we experience, like the feeling, the sensation of that emotion. And so many times our knee-jerk reaction with those emotions is to instantly start chattering on top of them, to start this train of thought about the emotion and what might be causing it and what's likely to happen and all of this added surround. But what we don't realize is how fleeting our emotional experience is. And you can really see it if the next time you're experiencing a really strong emotion, instead of going in the direction that we typically go and chattering about it, you just do exactly what you said and almost bore into the physical sensation of that emotion. Like just concentrate on what it feels like. And it's shocking how fast it changes. We are fickle, fleeting little animals sometimes.
Exactly. Yes. I call that the shift. That's exactly it. Right. Mm-hmm. And the thing that we really need to know is that even our emotions are not actually attached to our situations. We think that we're scared because we're standing on a stage, but that's not actually true. That's the pattern, right? So, Lisa Feldman Barrett, How Emotions Are Made, I don't know if you've read that book, but she talks about how the same physical sensation, if you're in a bakery, will be translated by you as hunger. And if you're in a doctor's office, will be translated as fear. Exactly the same thing occurring. But, our brain is constantly trying to interpret the world around us. Like I was saying initially, it's locked in this bony skull and it does its best, but a lot of times it gets it wrong.
Yeah.
So I love what you're saying. Yeah, absolutely. Bore into it, really explore it, but not from the perspective of mind. That all our thoughts are along for the ride. They just ride in on the back of the pattern.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And talk a little bit about that, because this is something we hit a lot, and I don't think we've woven it in to this specific behavior change conversation. Certainly not recently, but it's an important one to make, this distinction between us and our thoughts, the role that our thoughts play and the connection we have to them. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because this feels key in a situation where we're trying to make a big shift, with the role that they can play in that pattern.
Oh, yeah. Thought in our culture has been elevated to a position of you. We relate to our thoughts as if they are our identity, right?
Yeah.
When we start to understand patterns, we start to realize how there is no logic in any of our thinking. Thought is just in support of our patterns. Yeah? Stop me if I'm not making sense.
It's perfect. Yep.
So when we know that, then we can start to, it's not like we have to distrust our thoughts, but certainly we need to stop putting the emphasis there. That is not the initiator of the pattern. So what happens? Well, how do you move from the pattern that you're running right now, April, to a different pattern, right? Because inside you is millions of patterns, okay? Yep. Some of them are working, some of them aren't. So let's go back to my dating example. So you go on a date and you're getting dressed, and suddenly you realize, like, oh my gosh, I am totally scared here. What happened, right? Well, what happened was the act of thinking about the date, the act of getting dressed for the date triggered a particular pattern. Mm-hmm. And what got triggered first is not the mind, but the body. Okay. So the physical sensation, the emotion comes before the thought comes into play. Mm-hmm. And inside that, so the body's going through something, the body gets stressed, and the mind then comes in to interpret that stress. And it's almost as if we could hear the conversation between body and mind. All right. Here's how it would go. The body starts getting anxious. The mind comes in and says, what's up, body? What's going on? Right. And then mind says, okay, I'll interpret that for you. And I'll tell you why it is you're feeling that. And it says, oh, yeah, it's because we're going on a date. That must be why body's nervous and anxious. And then it says, let's not go on that date. This is too scary. Are you getting it? Mm-hmm. So because we then believe that thought, we stop ourselves and we try and fix the situation. Mm-hmm. Okay. So now we spend all this effort trying to change that mind, trying to change the situation, trying to date the right person, on and on and on and on we go. And if we can just start to say, okay, I get it. I'm feeling nervous and I have no idea why, but I'm just anxious right here in this situation. Put the mind on one side, as you say, bore into that experience, and it will shift. That's definitely going to change, as you know, and the mind will be thinking differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is the result of doing that repetitively?
Repetitively, you start to gain you achieve your goals. First of all, let's just say you're in action in the direction of your goals. Anytime that you're not, you know exactly what to do. You know you're empowered because you can say, okay, I got a pattern that's not working. You have 4 steps so you can address that pattern, shift that pattern, boom, you're back in action again. So you're in constant action. But here's the biggest benefit that I found, because it's not about goal achievement. How many people do we know who have achieved the goals that they set out to get and they're miserable? Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
That's totally common, isn't it?
Yep.
And it's because we, again, have positioned mind over matter and said that we should consciously know what will bring us happiness. right?
Yeah.
And when we achieve it, we typically end up going, what was I thinking? Why am I here? So knowing that patterns are in control, knowing that all we have is workable or unworkable patterns, as we start to be able to play with these patterns in our mind, something really amazing happens. We start to experience life with this happiness, peace of mind. The yogis have an expression, happiness is your birthright. Have you ever heard that?
Mm-hmm.
It's what they mean is that when we are listening to ourselves, when we are truly present with ourselves, when we stop thinking that our conscious mind knows and we start trusting the unconscious to take us in the direction that it wants us to go, we not only achieve the success that we want and need, I should say need rather than want, but also we achieve happiness and peace of mind, and those relationships become conflict-free, and everything that we're striving to get in life actually becomes available.
Yeah. So this is reminding me a lot of some of the work that, it's funny because Ashley and I, again, Ashley, my partner in Peak Mind, she and I talk about all the time on the podcast and in other venues about how every single thing that we teach on this podcast, in our programs, when we speak on webinars, it doesn't matter. Every single thing that we teach, we practice. And this, a lot of what you're talking about around separating yourself from your thoughts, paying attention to your bodily sensations or the experience of your emotions purely, not as an interpretation of it, but purely the physiological, what does my body feel like? Where is it? How intense is it? Is it heavy? Is it painful? Whatever. Paying attention to that sensation specifically, so much of that is something that I practice on a literal daily basis. And the reason why is there's a number of, I would say, I'll call them mentors. They don't know they're mentoring me. I'm reading their books and I'm following their apps and that type of thing. But a number of mentors talk about the degree of suffering that human beings experience simply because we can't do those two things. We can't experience an emotion for the sake of the emotion, not for the interpretation of it. And we can't distance ourselves from the running train of thought that has nothing to do with us. So if there's two, and this is why I said, what happens if you do this repeatedly? If there are two things that I could tell people flat out, if you want to practice two things that will change your life, it's those two things, because everything unravels from there. It's exactly as you're saying. At some point, those patterns break down, or when they flare up, you see them for what they are, and you're able to make decisions about how you act afterward. But it takes that bit of practice and self-awareness in order to do it. So I love that so much because it's life-changing for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And you are right. We suffer way too much in this culture, way too much. And it's precisely because of that. And can I just be totally real here, April? And
Get it. Yes.
Okay. This idea of positive thinking is actually the thing that's making us unhappy.
Mm-hmm. Tell me more.
Well, if we think about it, right? Here we have these patterns that are our unconscious is always trying to communicate with us. Okay. So our brain has this plasticity, like I was saying, it's always rewiring. And yet we have these patterns that are obsolete now that we're carrying around. And we now have a goal that we're trying to get to, whatever that is. It might even be just be happiness, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so our unconscious, every aspect of our being wants us to be happy and in relationship and successful. There isn't a single part of us that will sabotage that. So here we have this unconscious that knows on some level, right? And I'm not saying that it knows verbally, but it knows on some level that we are running an obsolete pattern. And it keeps trying to tell us, hey, that pattern's not going to take you to that goal. But it doesn't speak English, so it can't use that. So what it does is it makes us feel uncomfortable. It makes us suffer, right? And in that suffering, if we know how to translate that suffering, we would just simply say, oh, I'm suffering. I must be running an obsolete pattern. I have to upgrade that, right? And then I'll find happiness. Okay. But what do we do instead? Instead of listening to our unconscious, as you're saying, instead of drilling down into that emotion and that where we feel that in the body, instead we say, oh gosh, there's something wrong with me. I better think more positive. Okay, now what are we doing? We're totally denying the body, the subconscious's experience of the moment. We are making ourselves wrong in the process. We're making how we feel in this moment incorrect because, we should be positive, right? And so all of this is just forcing conscious and subconscious to have this internal battle where we just keep suffering because the unconscious keeps saying, no, listen up, right? Stop doing that. Start paying attention to me. I'm trying to show you how to get to that goal, but it can't say that in language. And so the more we run down this path, the more suffering we are all going into.
I love that you brought up this idea of this shift to just think positive, just put your rose-colored glasses on and march into life. We could do almost a composite episode on the number of guests who have made this point for different reasons. We had Steve Hayes, the founder of Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, on the podcast about a year ago, and he mentioned the same thing, but from the perspective of by just thinking positive, by avoiding and ignoring our negative emotions, we miss the information they're trying to tell us. Something can't hurt you, and you can't say miss something or feel grief about something if it didn't mean something to you. And there's insight into what really matters to you when you feel negative emotions, and instead of turning away from them and do and trying to force yourself to think positive, but instead sit with them and find out what they mean. It tells you what's important to you. And then finding a way to maybe incorporate that or move in a direction that's helpful, but you miss that lesson entirely. So you're making the point from a slightly different perspective, but the bottom line is similar. This notion of just think positively, it's really not a good game plan for us.
No, it isn't. And I'm so happy you mentioned that because I think it's ran its course, right?
Yeah.
I think that's what's happened, where we've reached the point where we've tried it. I mean, and if you think about it, this idea about think positive has been around for almost 100 years, right? I mean, and so we tried it. If it worked, it would have worked by now. That's what I always say. So, let's relook at those operating instructions and think again. And I love that everybody is starting to say, hey, the emotions have it. Hey, we need to dive back into the body and stop putting the emphasis on the mind. That is amazing and brings me real hope.
I love it. Tell me what your definition of psychological strength is.
I would say my definition of psychological strength is the ability to take every experience and recognize its value. I have a different definition of success than most people. I find that what most people define as success is all the things we're used to, right? Happiness, fulfillment, a good career, a good family, and all of this, and on and on and on. My definition of success is have as many experiences in life as you can. Life is this amazing buffet, taste it all. So grieve, be happy, be sad, be hated, be loved, like just if I could get to the end of my life and just have collected as many experiences as possible, I would say, Yahoo, that's success to me. And so to do that, I've got to get out of my own way repeatedly, right? I have to constantly fall down, get up, fall down, get up. And so to me, that is real psychological strength.
You and I are kindred spirits for sure. Tell us where we can find more information about you, tell us a little bit about your book, where people can get it. Give us the scoop on that so people can learn more.
Well, I would love to gift your listener a free book. They can get it at Shift 4 Steps, and I'm going to spell that out. So that's SHIFT, the number 4 steps, STEPS.com. All I ask is that you pay for shipping, but I will pay for the book. I've already bought it for you.
That's so sweet.
And there's some free training in there too that your listener can get. So if they're interested in getting the 4 steps, I'm here to spread the word. And so whatever I can do to support, jump on Shift 4 Steps as a place to start. If you want to know more about patterns, though, go to adelespraggon.com.
And we'll make sure we link to both of those in this episode description. So if you're listening to this and you're trying to madly write, just go ahead and swipe up on whatever podcast app you're listening to, and those 2 links will be in the episode description. So know that they will be there one click away for you to take advantage of that. I am so grateful that we got connected. As I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, this is one of my very favorite topics to dive into because there's so much here, and it's something that impacts people. I would love to say on a daily basis, but it's probably an hourly or even more often than that basis. It's so fundamentally critical to every aspect of our lives. So I appreciate you so much for being here, Adele. This has been so fantastic. We just really appreciate you giving us your time.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, April. Thank you for having me.
It's a simple fact that nearly everyone in the world could benefit from building psychological strength, but not everyone will put in the time and effort to do so. But today you did. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Building Psychological Strength. Now, if you're interested in building the mental toughness, confidence, and resilience you need to thrive through life's ups and downs, visit us at www.peakmindpsychology.com. Also, if there's someone in your life who could benefit from this episode, please share it with them. And if you yourself found this episode valuable, meaning if you took away even one insight that you can use to build psychological strength in your own life, we would so appreciate it if you would drop us a rating and a review on iTunes. The thing is, the more ratings and reviews we have, the easier it is to get this powerful and important content out to the people who need to hear it. Remember, your mind can be your most valuable asset or your biggest liability, and you get to choose. So choose wisely, my friend. And I'll see you next time on Building Psychological Strength.